So our guest speaker today is Zack Zappone, City Council member in Spokane, Washington. Zack is a Spokane native. He was raised in a working class union family that was dedicated to public service. A first generation college graduate of Georgetown and a Fulbright scholar, Zack earned a master's in public affairs from Princeton. After teaching in Eastern Washington and advocating for educational reform, he entered public service as a Spokane City Council member in 2021. On the council, Zack has led efforts to reform the city's zoning, including eliminating exclusionary single-family zoning, removing parking mandates, and reducing housing costs and barriers to housing. Zack also, as a council member, serves on the Spokane Transit Authority board, and he's been a champion for accessible and improved public transportation. So without further ado, Zack Zappone.
Well, thanks for having me, and great to see everyone, and thanks for joining. I saw we have some international folks too, and I'll share. I actually did my Fulbright for a year in Colombia, so I have a little bit of international living experience too, and studied abroad in college, but that's a little more fun. But I'm gonna share my screen. I just have a few slides here just to talk through kind of the process that we went through here in Spokane to achieve some parking reform. And then we'll be really conversational and open it up for conversation. So let me see. All right, so for those of you who don't know Spokane that well, Spokane is the second largest city in Washington state, and we are located in Eastern Washington, about 4 hours drive from Seattle. We're the second largest city, about 220,000 people in the city proper and 500,000 people in our metro area. And a lot of the development of Spokane and the growth came first from the railroad in the 1800s and then with the car. And so with that growth, we saw a lot of downtown parking is what we did. So there's a ton and a massive excess of surface parking lots in downtown Spokane. So all the red in this area shows our urban core from our, our like entertainment district, our arena and sports stadiums, through the downtown offices and shopping and entertainment and nightlife. And the purple are the parking garages. And we've done a downtown parking study. The most recent one was before COVID, and that was, I think it was 2019. And it showed even at our maximum highest utilized days of parking throughout the year, we're only using about 50% of our parking capacity through garages and surface parking lots and street parking too. So we have a lot of excess parking. When I was elected in 2021, so I started in 2022 as my first year, the state legislature here gave cities the ability to incentivize parking and or turning over surface parking lots or underutilized property and incentivizing that into housing. And that was really championed by our state representative, state senator here in Spokane, who knew this problem that we have here. And so he got the permission from the state to waive the sales tax on new construction. But that's permissible throughout multiple cities in the state. But we were the only city so far in the state that has actually utilized that tax incentive. And so we implemented that at the beginning of 2023, or later in 2022. It was passed in about March 22, and we implemented it later in the year. And we called that the pavement to people, incentivizing housing. The state legislature required that half of the, it was only way for housing, and half of the units had to be affordable housing. Here, that's defined at about, it was 80% area median income is what the state required. So this waives the sales tax from the city and the state. It's about 6.5% of state sales tax that is waived. 3% of local sales tax for 9% reduction in their costs. This has been a great incentive for development. That we are just getting our first projects off the ground right now to that are using that tax incentive. So we have new construction that is being built that's going to be over 200 new units on that. I don't think we included that in the slides, but our first buildings are being built, 200 units, and then we have about 5 other projects. Interestingly, we're seeing that it's not being incentivized for like the urban core around that purple garage area, It's on kind of the more fringe parts of the core that people are using that. And part of that's just the construction costs are really high. And so even waiving the sales tax is not quite enough to pencil out projects. But we have 5 different projects now that have applied for permits using that sales tax incentive. And so that's been a great start to a program over the last 2 years. There's still things that we are hoping to change and asking the legislature, particularly around the affordability. We're finding that not as many projects as we were hoping for would get started because the affordability requirements are so great for developers that they're not able to pencil out their projects. So that was our first foray into really changing the conversation around parking in Spokane that culminated at the end in the middle of this year with eliminating parking mandates altogether. The second one was, like many cities across the world, housing is a major problem in Spokane, and affordable housing. Our housing stock is low, and during COVID, our median home values went from about $270,000 to about $400,000 now. And so there's a massive increase in costs associated with houses, especially first-time homeowners, renters, and we're seeing that problem. So our mayor has declared a housing crisis, and with that, it allowed some expedited passage of laws that we could do as a city council on things that focused on housing. So in 2023, we passed, I'm trying to remember the timing. It was actually late 2022. We passed what we call Pavement to People, eliminating barriers to housing. And this one focused on parking mandates. Like most cities, we had extensive list of different parking mandates from that are illogical, from residential having one parking requirement per off-street parking requirement per unit, to bowling alleys and daycare centers and churches, all of those parking requirements. So because there was this declaration of housing, there's a lot of political will around addressing housing affordability too. We talked about one of the barriers of that more affordable housing being parking, and thanks to the Parking Reform Network and Sightline, who's going to talk in 2 weeks, had lots of research that showed the impacts and the costs associated with that we were able to use in our conversation here and our argument for eliminating those parking reforms. So the council passed a 1-year pilot, an interim ordinance that removed parking mandates for housing within a half mile of any transit stop in the city, not just frequent transit or high performance transit, but just any transit stop. If it was within a half a mile, there would be no parking mandates for any residential use. That was really done in a way that I'm a more liberal council member, and I partnered with a conservative council member, and we engaged our stakeholders, and we did this in a way that really focused on housing, which is a crisis for everyone in the region, and built a coalition around that to try to prevent any of the type of neighborhood pushback or NIMBY pushback that you typically see across when these changes are happening. And so we had this political, bipartisan approach, stakeholder engagement approach, and had them sign on. And we actually had a press conference where we announced this change together, him and I, plus our stakeholders, and some of our more conservative stakeholders here in Spokane are kind of the Realtors Association, the Home Builders Association, and our more liberal stakeholders like environmental groups, land use groups, advocacy groups, low-income housing groups. And we all stood up together, and oftentimes these are groups that are really pitted against each other and said, this is a policy that we support and believe in. And as you can see in this graphic here, a half a mile of any transit stop was really pretty extensive in our city. We have a fairly good network of transit in the city. And so it covers a lot of the core and just misses kind of these fringe areas in the red. We did have some debate if it should be a quarter mile of a transit stop, a quarter mile of frequent transit, or a half mile of frequent transit. Those conversations were had. but we kind of had this bolder vision of, let's just say, half mile of any transit stop. And of course, talking about, we're not prohibiting parking, but allowing, not requiring it, these costly government mandates, and kind of having that type of messaging. So after this 1-year pilot program, which was passed 6-1 at the council level, it was really close to unanimous. And we really had very little pushback from the community. I think we had 3 people come and testify the night that we adopted it, and there was only 1 person that testified against it and 2 in support. So we did this 1-year interim ordinance or pilot, and then the next year we made that a permanent change just regarding residential zoning and housing. After that, we've been having these conversations about what are the other mandates that we could look into and do outreach on that. And we looked at all our commercial and industrial zoning, in addition to the red areas of residential zoning. And we had our planning commission here at the city was doing some updates on center zone corridors. That's kind of our land use plan on where to focus more urban growth. And as they were doing that, they brought up parking reform as a conversation when they were doing all their community outreach. We also, as city council members, hosted a town hall about it. It was just me and another council member, but we were doing our own outreach on parking reform and hearing for folks. And there was some grassroots advocacy groups that are very interested in parking reform too. And so with that outreach, we heard from folks that were interested in doing some more extensive parking reform mandates. And I would say that our staff were typically recommending something they thought was more palatable politically, or more cautious, kind of what they were hearing in the community. And we're really kind of still focusing on this incremental change. And they brought forward a proposal of just eliminating parking mandates within those centers and corridors only. This is 2024, and we had an election this year. We had a mayor that was very supportive of eliminating parking mandates, council members that were really supportive of it too. And so we talked, and I put forward an amendment to eliminate all of our parking mandates altogether. This is a picture of our code from our parking mandates, just part of it. But where it was built in the code, as you can see, it has it kind of by category or use, and the number of square footage and how many spots you had to have. I think the cleanest way we talked about with our plan director, who's also very supportive of these changes, would be to eliminate this table. But for simplicity of kind of the process that we'd been talking about, we went forward with this, as you see, where we crossed out all of the minimum requirements and just put none there instead, while we still have some maximum requirements too. And so that's what our code looks like. We implemented that change and voted on it this summer, and that was it was a 4-1 vote, but 2 members were gone who would have been supportive, or likely would have been supportive, and so it would have probably been a 6-1 vote. Our big pushback, the council member who voted against it was a conservative member, and he was really concerned, really hyper focused on a neighborhood where a university's at in our city, and a lot of cars that come and park by that university and the conflicts that it has with residents in that neighborhood. But we talked about, with the 1-year pilot, we didn't see dramatic changes. This isn't tearing down neighborhoods, but creating more flexible options. And we're seeing more units that are being built and more housing that is being able to be built because of these changes. And that was really seen as a success. And some projects have come up in neighborhoods now that are getting some little direct concerns about their projects not having enough parking. But by and large, it has not been a hugely controversial issue for us, despite being the first city in the state to eliminate, first major city to permanently eliminate them. There was a smaller city that beat us by a couple months to eliminating their parking ones as an interim. So some lessons learned. Here's that press conference that we had. And behind us is that white building was a newer build that we had in our downtown core that was an underutilized space, largely parking with like a drive-through bank. And they rebuilt that into hundreds of units of housing, and it's seen as really a positive change to our downtown core to get more people living there. And so some of our lessons that when I reflect on it was really building that broader coalition of community stakeholders, but also the politicians themselves to be on the same page and working together, even when they're often opposing each other. Getting ahead of the narrative, I think, was important for us too. We really were kind of in that driver's seat of defining how we would talk about parking in Spokane, rather than waiting for people to have the backlash. We were really intentional about talking about the problem, how this parking reform offers that solution to a problem. And the problem that every politician here is elected for is housing. And so really connecting it to that problem with a lot of political will was good. And then being okay with that incremental progress. I've been talking to a couple other council members and folks in Washington that are trying to move for statewide reform. And oftentimes they're really ambitious and wanting to eliminate altogether. And those were conversations we had, and that was my goal. But I think for tempting down people who might really start getting scared, I guess, of that change, doing that incremental progress, doing it as a one-year interim, really kind of calmed them down from being afraid that their whole neighborhoods would be torn down and changed. Because we could point to saying it's been in effect for a year. Did anything bad happen? No, actually, we had a few new buildings be built and new housing, and this is a really positive change. So that kind of incremental progress, I think, has helped. And then we've talked about, we haven't implemented anything, but to address concerns that folks have about, more on-street parking, not being able to park in their neighborhoods. We've mentioned wanting to monitor those sorts of situations so that we can address them with new programs, whether that's a residential parking program. Our city doesn't have any residential parking programs or permits, only the downtown core. And so really trying to be mindful of that and wanting to monitor that as change evolves over time. And so that's kind of the lessons and the process that we did to eliminating our parking mandates here in Spokane. My contact information too, that can be shared at the end, but that's kind of all I'm prepared to talk about, and then happy to have more of a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really great to have you here and to get these insights. I'll say to everybody in attendance here too, as you think of questions, by all means, please post them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and we really want to have this be a collective discussion and get your questions answered. I'm wondering, Zach, so not just with the parking, but with some of the other zoning reforms you guys have done, Spokane has emerged as, certainly within Washington State, but I would say even a national leader on zoning reform with the intention of making new housing easier. There's been a lot of press. Now, the Inlander recently published a piece titled "How Spokane Gained Its Urbanist Reputation." And I'm wondering, because like I exist in this sort of bubble of advocates who are working on these issues. So I read that and I go, yeah, Spokane's urbanist reputation. I tell people about Spokane all the time. I'm wondering if the picture of the city painted there, how many of your constituents would recognize that? Like, do you see a broader kind of accompanying this policy shift in Spokane? Do you see a cultural shift?
Yeah, that's a good one. I actually haven't read that article yet, but I'm quoted in it. I know that. My dad just told me this week. He's like, I saw you were in this article, and I was like, oh, I need to read this. But yeah, I didn't really touch on that housing, just so everyone else knows. At the same time, we actually eliminated all single family zoning in Spokane, and we upzoned to up to 4 to 6 units per every single lot in the entire city. And so that's pretty aggressive for really everywhere else in the nation to do that sort of upzoning, while also eliminating the parking requirements too. And we're really trying to focus rather on saying like what type of housing you can have. We're like saying, if our plan director is really great at this work, and I think he's a great messenger on conveying this, but really focusing on like, does it matter if the box is the same size. Doesn't matter how many units are inside the box. So that's kind of how we've been having that conversation here and carrying it. But how has the culture shifted? I think we have, there's not like a very huge, strong grassroots urbanist community here. We have subsections of groups of folks who care a lot about it. But there's not this like ground swelling of change for urbanism. It is a thing that as I was running and talking about this change in a vision for Spokane that is less car dependent, more walkable. Really, folks are resonating with that. We have a new neighborhood in Spokane that was built around 2010. That is a really dense neighborhood. That is kind of a model for multi-use neighborhood, corner coffee shops, and townhouses that we don't have throughout the rest of the city. And it's really kind of a destination and a really attractive part of town where people are like, oh, let's go to the farmer's market in Kendall Yards. Let's go to the shops in Kendall Yards. And they really like that. And so we're actually getting the developers building another kind of one of those replications in another part of town too. So I think there's this cultural shift to more walkable interests, but it's not, I wouldn't say there's just this like groundswell of support for folks saying like, yeah, we are an urban city and we are changing. A lot of like myself, I'm sixth generation from Spokane. We have a lot of folks who will come to Spokane, leave and come back. And there's a lot of wonderful things. There's a picture of our waterfalls in the downtown, which is beautiful. But it is that kind of cultural shift that is slow. And I think we're seeing it a lot with youth too. And I talk about that with youth, and I talk about affordability for families to stay together, because we have this multi-generations of families staying here that if their families can't stay, what's more important to you? Your neighborhood looking the way it looks, or your grandkids being able to live in a place that's affordable and close to you? And really trying to frame it that way.
Right. I got a few more questions, but I also see the chat is busy here, and I want to prioritize letting our attendees get their questions asked here. So I might pick from what we got here in the chat. Here's one from Paul Fritz. Do you think both the downtown parking study and the one-year pilot were important to get political buy-in?
Yeah, I do. I think the study gives you a talking point in fact, because otherwise it's just kind of based on fears rather than on facts. And so when we're able to say, look, our parking is only 50% at capacity at the highest points of the year, then people are like, oh, my perception is I drive around in circles trying to find a parking spot. The reality is there's actually a ton of parking. I just don't want to go into a garage usually. And so I think having some of the stats, and we had that was done by our business improvement district in the downtown. They facilitated that with the city too. But that really kind of was a main talking point for us to say, look, those fears are not grounded. And the one-year pilot, absolutely. And I think I mentioned that. I think that really calmed a lot of folks down. They're like, okay, it's 1 year. We'll see how it goes, sort of thing.
For sure. I want to get at a question here that's from David Miski. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies if not, David. But and I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit. It kind of dovetails with what I was going to ask. But David writes, I frequently hear, oh, you need a car to get around here. Or, that stuff's more appropriate for bigger cities, but it doesn't work here. We're a smaller city, we're rural. And I've encountered that a lot too, to what extent, Spokane is a mid-sized city. But I'm guessing that you hear some of that from people. Everybody's got a car here. We're a place where we're not Seattle, let alone New York. I've wondered also, maybe even in the context of taking the progression of steps that you did, where you start with parking mandates near transit. I've had the concern from time to time that, as that becomes the incremental bite that people take of this issue, it almost reinforces this narrative that, well, this is something that is about anti-car politics or about getting people out of cars, versus something that is appropriate even in places where people do drive and are going to continue to drive. So I'm curious kind of to what extent that came up in Spokane, to what extent you grappled with those narratives.
Yeah, no, I think that narrative is spot on all the time. We hear that all the time, like, oh, that doesn't work here. We're too car dependent. We're not built for that. You're going to make it so hard that we want like we're not going to be able to drive or park anywhere. And I mean, like, honestly, I'm like, that is kind of the shift that we need to make, is to show like the real cost of cars rather than subsidizing cars, to the point where eventually you'll be like, oh, it's actually cheaper and easier for me to take the bus, even though it might be a little more inconvenient, or to bike or to walk, and making those alternative choices. But it is very cheap to park downtown. Our street parking is grossly under costs, even for the city. So there are lots of folks that are very concerned about that. One thing that I'm a teacher, that's my day job. I teach 7th grade right now. And I often point to like the generational shifts that we're seeing, and a little bit of the shifts from the state level too, and conversations that are happening nationally, and pointing out like, look, kids these days aren't getting their license like they used to. Like when I turned 16, I got my license. I teach, my middle school's in a high school. It's kind of a magnet program. I was like, I teach with high schoolers that they're just not getting their license. They're not interested. And we need to have that change, and that cultural change for the future that we want too. And they're not going to be driving. So we need to be building the infrastructure for that. And then with the state change, there's bills that the state's been working on for both housing and parking too. And I've been working with some of the activists at the state level too on the state change. But kind of one thing that I talk about too when I'm talking to folks is like, look, we're heading that way. Do we want to do it our way, or do we want someone else to do it and tell us what to do? And there's a lot of sentiment of like, we want to do it our way. Like, we don't want other people telling us what to do. We don't want the government to tell us what to do. A little Eastern Washington is on the other side of the mountain range from Seattle. So as a Democrat in Eastern Washington, when I campaign, I'm like, I'm not a Seattle Democrat. I'm an Eastern Washington Democrat. We're different. We're not the same. Like we respect people, but we don't want the government telling us what to do all the time. Interestingly, some of the language I see around Kamala Harris now too. But so when we're talking about parking mandates, that was part of the narrative too, is just like, these are costly government mandates that, like, why should the government be telling property owners what to do? Why should we be telling businesses what to do with their properties? Let them decide what they want to do. Let them decide how to make a profit for their business. There's going to be parking built because they want it. Like, a business that doesn't think that they can attract people is still going to build parking. And we have lenders still. So that's part of the problem. We still have lenders that won't give out banks or loans to new businesses to construct without parking, because they don't think it's going to work. So it's a slow cultural shift. But I think trying to reframe it and thinking, one, like doing it our way without the government telling us what to do. And then this cultural generational shift is a big change that we're seeing.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I love your focus on sort of preempting some of the narratives. Like, we're going to make sure this is bipartisan from day one. We're going to show that it's bipartisan. We're going to, there's so much of that with these kind of reforms in terms of like getting people to trust you, or at least hear you out. Like, who else has done this that is going to be a positive model versus like a negative model that's going to polarize people against something? I'm curious on
well, I was going to add too, I was like, we use the Parking Reform Network's maps that show that this is happening nationally and internationally. This is a trend that people are doing in comparable size cities like Richmond and Anchorage, Alaska, and these other cities that are doing the same thing. And so I think that was very useful for us here, and appreciate that national network of where we can point to and say this is happening nationally.
That makes me so happy. Every time I see the maps being used to do exactly that, that's wonderful. Evan Manville asks, are you hearing from councilors or mayors from other Washington cities who want to bring parking reform to their city, or even statewide umbrella organizations like the Association of Washington Cities talking about this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say Association of Washington Cities is on board for this, but there are members and cities that have reached out that are very interested and excited about this. And I've had several conversations similar, just sharing like how we did it and what we did. Even Seattle council members that are like, how did you do this? We get so much pushback. I don't understand why Spokane is not getting this pushback that we're getting. And the politics is a little different everywhere you go, because when I've talked to Seattle folks, they're like, oh, if we're building this coalition with realtors and developers, I think we actually like alienate the left so much because there's so much distrust with them. And there's a lot of distrust here too. But I think I could kind of bridge that gap between the communities where I was kind of more of a trusted from the left, and working with them, they kind of came along and supported a bit of what I believed in and trusted them to do on this issue. Again, it's not every issue, and it's really trying to break it apart as issue by issue. But yeah, no, I've had several mayors, several council members reach out and talk about it. And there is going to be proposed legislation at the state level that would or eliminate the mandate this legislative session. And so I've been working with some folks who are strategizing on how to try to do that at the state level too. And it is something that we at the city, similar to our housing, we advocated it for it across the state, because we were saying like, look, if we do it ourselves, that's great, but it doesn't help us when the surrounding areas aren't making these changes to housing, zoning, and parking changes too. Like, it really has to be this regional approach for us. It's not just one city can't do it alone.
Right. Housing markets are regional, commuting patterns are regional. It's all connected. I got a couple kind of maybe paired questions here. I think one cool thing about PRN is we sit at this nexus where people who are, our members who are involved in the network are in very different parts of the ecosystem of policy change, from elected officials to staff to, citizen advocates. So I'm always interested in drilling down on like, what is your role in parking reform, depending on where you sit on that spectrum? So I want to ask a question for you maybe about the role of staff in the process in this case. You mentioned your planning director, and I can second the praise there. I've known Spencer Gardner for a number of years, and truly a great guy. For places where, I think in general, people who are city planners, people who are on staff are often torn between this obligation to be sort of the dispassionate civil servant. You're not elected, you don't have a mandate to make policy. At the same time, you have a technical expertise that is necessary to implementing successful policy reforms, and it's going to lend itself to having some definite opinions about the shape that a successful policy is going to take. So if you are on that technical practitioner side of things in a place where you maybe don't have broad elected official consensus yet, what would your advice be to a planning director, to a staffer in that kind of situation, who is passionate about this issue and wants to see good things happen?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's very dependent on the dynamics of that. So it's like caveats. I don't want to say go do this, and then you're like, whoa, that blew up. But I feel like my impression from elected officials is there's often a lot of deference to staff and recognition of expertise. Again, some situations that might not work, but I do know that there's a lot of appreciation for that expertise and looking towards those experts. At the local level, we are a little bit more more full-time as a council, so we have that time to go and look at other advocacy groups for expertise, where smaller cities might not have members who really do that research or have the connections to do that, and they're really leaning more on staff to bring that up. And I don't know how many times I've been in meetings where it's like, well, staff said that, so we're going to do that. And so I guess I encourage staff to recognize that they do have a lot of power in shaping the conversation and the narrative. And like in this case, we went above the staff recommendation and did more than what staff recommended. So, and I think there's a lot of trust with our planning department too, where they're like, you look, we're happy to give you recommendations, and they'll tell us, you're the decision maker. You have a lot more calculations than I do on this. But I want to give you kind of the expertise where we see it happening, and give you that expertise. And so I guess to staff, I would say like, share it as expertise, and then recognize like, I've given it to you, I've shared it with you, and then I'm going to step away and let you make the decision. And I think that helps keep a strong relationship of trust. Because I think once it's seen as like, trying to push an agenda, that's where elected officials might stop trusting the expertise, and where they just keep it more factual and presenting it. But there is, the way you shape an argument and what data you show can change a conversation. And so make sure to tell that story, I guess, is what I would say too.
Right, right. Um, what about, constituents who are kind of on the activist side of things? The question I always like to ask is, as an elected official, if you think about your constituents who are kind of in agreement with you, broadly speaking, what is something that activist citizens do that makes your job easier? And what is something that people who agree with you, not who are opponents, do that makes your job harder?
That's a fun question. I think since being an elected official, I have even greater appreciation for the advocates and activist side. And I think from the outside, I felt like it was never, like you're never making enough progress. But now from being an elected official, they create a window of opportunity from the community that is incredibly important. And that gives a window for elected officials to operate in. And I just know so many elected officials don't want to be seen as having their own agenda and doing their own thing, but they want to be seen as representing a community, representing their constituents, representing people, not just pushing their own ideas. And so I always encourage activists, yes, go really big, right? Change the narrative, like say, eliminate it citywide. And then I might come in and do the incremental, but like appreciate that that's still progress. And I guess that goes to what makes it difficult is that I think activists often push for really hard, and even the dynamic within a council, you have members of a council who will push really high, and then the compromise group that will kind of go up in between. And so there's this like recognition that, push for like eliminate everything. You want the big picture, but still celebrate the incremental progress, even though it's not exactly what you wanted. And I've had activist groups that are really still critical when it is that incremental progress, and they come in and they're like, you should have done more, you're not doing enough, this isn't good enough. And it's like, oh, but like we're doing this because of you, we're doing this for you, like can you just appreciate something? It's like celebrate that win at that vote in that day, and then start organizing again after that. And there's some activists that will sometimes make it a little bit more personal against different members, and I think that also makes it hard when you start coming in and making it hard or attacking people personally. That makes it hard. Keep it about like facts and narrative, and then build your own membership, get more press, get more attention, do testify. I won't always say it affects the votes of the members, but it affects the press coverage because they will often pull quotes from people who are testifying at things. So recognize your audience isn't necessarily always council members. It's a public narrative, and how can you keep changing that public narrative? Put out your own press releases, put out your own reports, give us facts that we can use, and call on us to do stuff.
Wonderful. We are at 3:15, 1:15, whatever your time zone says it is, 15. I think that's about the time we have today. But Zach, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. Great to have you here. And congrats again on what you've been able to do so far in Spokane.
And I dropped my email in the chat. If anyone ever has any follow-up, feel free to follow up. Happy to have more conversation. And I saw a transit question, just so you know, our youth are all riding the buses now. The state gave us free transit, and so like high school kids are all riding the bus to school. We got rid of the yellow bus primarily, which has been a huge generational shift too.